I mean utterly replaceable. Okay, the political and legal realms that follow that, the bastions that follow the cultural context, are developing laws, regulations, and procedures that are isolating men from their families, from their properties, from their marriages, that are actually removing a number of sexual health issues. For example, men typically have almost zero sexual reproductive rights. You know, you actually have more rights to your intellectual property rights than your own physical DNA. You know, and not only that, society is controlling our ability to communicate. Society does not want men speaking up. Feminism, in essence, is a single form of single gender politics with only one seat at the table, and women like it that way. And I'm not saying women are to slander them in a big picture, but the politics being driven by this is gearing to control men's sexual behaviors, sexual culture, and control men within that culture of providing for women in a number of ways. I don't mean just in a physical and a material way, but in an emotional and psychological way as well. We suspend accountability for women culturally. You know, throw all that on top of a very, very unchanging biological context. You know, we have not changed biologically for millennia. Our base nature hasn't changed. And so you're throwing all this sort of together in a way in which most men are unprepared for. We don't recognize what we're facing. So based on that, I'm going to start breaking some of that down as far as the context and the environmental context. One of the most important and the fundamental is identifying the age in which we live. If we're going to be looking at architecture, it's important to understand the time frame in which it was created, to understand why they were doing what they were doing, what solutions they were trying to meet, what were the programmatic objectives. And in that regard, we live in a fascinating time frame. We live in the age in which men can ask themselves probably the question of our era. Who do I want to be? Who do I want to become? What type of life do I want to live? And the nature of it. At no other time in human history have men of any social standing, any social status been able to honestly ask those questions. Typically, those questions have been reserved for a very, very small minority of individuals on this planet. Today, everybody who's here and some of the people that are looking at this video now can ask themselves that question. And I find that revolutionary. The second thing is to recognize not only do you have that privilege, but there's an expectation that comes with it. And it's a tough one. And this is where you're going to come face to face with the age. And that is, physically, it is almost impossible to leave your parents' home, become a new, quote, an aged adult, and have the knowledge and awareness associated with the information age. We live in a knowledge-based economy, a service-based economy. That requires a high degree of education. A high degree of education coupled with practical experience. That takes time. That takes effort. Back in the day, they used to call it the college years. All right? What they're finding is it's more dynamic than just going and getting a degree. It's not just a 4-year program anymore. It's closer to a decade. You need that practical experience. Not only that, practical education is now coming into question. It is completely possible to get a higher educated degree, a STEM degree, a science, technology, engineering, math type based degree, and still be completely unemployed in this age. Our contacts with our employer, our contacts within the business realm in which we're operating can pretty much guarantee you will have 10 to 12 jobs in a 20-year period. You know, if you're lucky, it will be shorter. You know, you'll have a longer stint in that. You'll have a little more stability. But we no longer have this expectation that you will work at a same job for 20 years and retire with the company you got your first job with. You are no longer brought up through the company. It is easier to outsource. It is easier to hire without and transfer, knowledge-based. You know, basically stair-stepping. You got to start thinking that way. If you don't, you're going to run into direct conflicts. You're going to have self-crises. You're not going to be prepared. And it will play out not only in your own personal lives, but in the relationships you have in very profound ways. Add on to that complexity, there's no single route in which to achieve this. It's now new. It's the Wild West. You now have any number of ways to do it. College is not the only route. And it may not be the best route. It may be the worst route. Not only do you not get necessarily a healthy education, depending on which school you go to, the quality of the education, but you will leave indebted to a degree that will be hobbling. You know, you will become basically financially indebted to the point that you become acquiescence to your own freedom of choice. That's called slavery. whether it's a physical shackle, whether it's a financial shackle. The results ends up bind you, okay? It weighs you down. You ultimately are going to be responsible for your own education, your own self-development. That's true in relationships, it's going to be true in anything in life. Keep that in mind. But as we look at the information age in general, I want to take a bigger step back and look at in the transition of mankind with social relationships, because that's what I'm going to be primarily speaking about. Is we've gone through in a historical evolution primarily 3 times. And this is not the first time we've had major social evolutionary changes. The first time is when we went from hunting and gathering to agriculture. And what you have is a degree of specialization taking place, and it's a dramatic specialization. Unfortunately, most of those time periods are undocumented. We can look back at areas where they transcended a bit to see some friction, some conflict, but on the whole, we can only kind of empathize and imagine what that conflict was like. But we do know that there was a degree of specialization taking place. The second would have been when we went from the agricultural age to the Industrial Revolution. There we do have documentation. But the issue here is that it wasn't just that we have the documentation. The documentation tells us very clearly it was single gender specialization. Men got more specialized. Men's roles of being able to provide became further specialized. Women on a whole, their dynamic role did not change. And as we go into the information age, we now have a significant change in the fact that we now have dual sex specialization. We talk about in a very kind of overt way about society becoming more feminized, and that is very true, and that is a direct outlay of the information age. But part of that feminization is realizing we have specialized roles where women are taking, fulfilling, and actually co-sharing in. Okay? And men have not adapted very well. Our psyche of belief has not actually kept up with the times. And if Darwin has taught us anything, it is the species that evolves appropriately for its time and the challenges it's faced that survives. And where men are failing, where men are feeling lost, they have not kept up with the times. We have not recognized that we have an increase in EQ, or emotional quotient, as far as what we expect in relationships and jobs and everything else. We have old school models of what it means to be a leader, to lead and to manage. It's fairly direct. They're typically referred to as hard skills. Women have brought in a whole series of other skills that are highly valuable to increase effectiveness, team building, networking, socialization, consensus building, collaboration, and overall a measure of diplomacy. You know, when you take this in an appropriate context. And these skills are highly utilized in business today. All right, but we don't teach them in men in relationships. Okay? Men who don't understand that, who don't learn that, who are not taught that or exposed to it, go into life at a deficit. And we need to realize we're at a disadvantage when we don't know something. And ignorance is no shelter from reality. It's a hard fact of life. These sort of skills, and while we utilize them in business, really are perfect for relationships. This is where you start developing them. You know, if you don't know how to understand how to set a boundary, if you don't know how to understand collaboration building in a relationship or consensus building in a relationship, properly lead and managing and maintaining a relationship, you're sure as hell not going to do it in business.